Question 1. The evaluation methodology shows that a contractor has submitted a bid bond request for a significant public infrastructure project. The contractor's financial statements appear adequate on the surface, and they have provided a list of recent project completions. However, the underwriter has limited time before the bid submission deadline. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for thorough underwriting with the urgency of the request, adhering to regulatory principles of prudent risk management? Option A. Conduct a focused review of the contractor's credit report, key financial ratios, and verify the existence and successful completion of at least one major project from their list, while noting any potential areas for further investigation post-bid. Option B. Advise the contractor that the time constraints prevent a proper underwriting review and suggest they seek a bond from another surety, thereby avoiding potential regulatory noncompliance. Option C. Request detailed financial projections, client references for all listed projects, and a comprehensive operational plan, explaining to the contractor that a full review is necessary regardless of the bid deadline. Option D. Issue the bid bond based on the provided financial statements and project list, assuming the information is accurate and sufficient for a preliminary assessment given the time constraints. The correct answer is D. Issue the bid bond based on the provided financial statements and project list, assuming the information is accurate and sufficient for a preliminary assessment given the time constraints. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a common challenge in contract surety underwriting, balancing the need for thorough risk assessment with the practicalities of timely bid bond issuance. The professional challenge lies in discerning genuine financial capacity and operational competence from superficial indicators, especially under tight deadlines. Misjudging these factors can lead to the issuance of bonds for contractors who ultimately default, causing significant financial loss to the surety and potential project disruption. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing surety operations, emphasize prudent underwriting practices designed to protect both the surety and the public interest by ensuring that only financially sound and capable contractors are bonded. Ethical considerations also demand that sureties act with due diligence and avoid taking on risks they do not fully understand or cannot adequately manage. The correct approach involves a multifaceted assessment that prioritizes verifiable financial strength, demonstrated experience, and a sound business plan. This includes a detailed review of financial statements, credit reports, and references, alongside an understanding of the contractor's project history and management capabilities. Regulatory compliance is paramount. Underwriters must adhere to established underwriting guidelines and solvency requirements to ensure the surety's financial stability and fulfill its obligations to obligees. This approach aligns with the principle of prudent risk management, which is a cornerstone of surety underwriting, and is often mandated by regulatory bodies to prevent undue exposure. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the contractor's stated financial figures without independent verification. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence and can lead to underwriting based on potentially misleading or inflated information. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of issuance over the depth of the underwriting review, especially for larger or more complex projects. This disregards the ethical obligation to thoroughly assess risk and can expose the surety to unacceptable levels of potential loss, violating the spirit of regulatory oversight designed to ensure solvency. Furthermore, neglecting to assess the contractor's experience and track record on similar projects, focusing only on current financial health, is a critical oversight. This ignores a key indicator of future performance and project completion capability, which is essential for mitigating performance risk, a core component of bid bond underwriting. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific project scope and the contractor's proposed role. This is followed by a systematic review of all available information, cross-referencing data from multiple sources. A key step is to identify any red flags or inconsistencies and to seek clarification from the contractor. The decision to issue a bid bond should be based on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers financial capacity, operational capability, and the contractor's overall business integrity, all within the bounds of applicable regulations and internal underwriting policies. Question 2. Research into the surety's response to a principal's default on a public works contract reveals 3 potential courses of action, financing the principal to complete the remaining work, engaging a new contractor to finish the project, or tendering the contract back to the obligee. Considering the regulatory framework governing contract surety in the United States, which of these approaches, when properly executed, best aligns with the surety's duty to mitigate its exposure while fulfilling its obligations to the obligee? Option A. Engaging a new contractor to complete the project without first exploring the feasibility of financing the principal. Option B. Immediately tendering the contract back to the obligee without further investigation or attempt to facilitate completion. Option C. Financing the principal to complete the contract, provided a thorough assessment confirms the principal's capacity to do so and a revised project schedule is agreed upon. Option D. Offering the obligee a lump sum payment significantly below the estimated cost of completion to settle the claim. The correct answer is C. Financing the principal to complete the contract, provided a thorough assessment confirms the principal's capacity to do so and a revised project schedule is agreed upon. Explanation: this scenario presents a professionally challenging situation for a surety because the principal's default on a construction contract triggers a complex set of obligations and potential liabilities. The surety must act swiftly and strategically to mitigate its exposure while fulfilling its contractual duties to the obligee. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate financial implications of the default against the long-term consequences of each chosen course of action, all within the strictures of the contract and applicable law. Careful judgment is required to select the option that best preserves the surety's financial health and reputation, while also ensuring the project's completion in a manner that satisfies the obligee. The correct approach involves a thorough evaluation of the principal's financial standing, the project's progress, and the obligee's needs, leading to a decision to either finance the principal to complete the contract, arrange for completion by a third party, or tender the contract to the obligee. This comprehensive assessment ensures that the surety acts in accordance with its obligations under the surety bond and relevant statutes, such as those governing contract performance and financial responsibility. Ethically, the surety is bound to act in good faith towards both the principal and the obligee. Financing the principal, if viable, can be the most cost-effective and relationship-preserving option. Arranging for completion by a third party allows the surety to maintain control over the process and costs. Tendering the contract to the obligee, while less common, may be appropriate in specific circumstances where other options are unfeasible. The overarching regulatory and ethical imperative is to act prudently to minimize losses and fulfill the surety's promise. An incorrect approach would be to simply abandon the principal and refuse to address the default. This would be a clear breach of the surety bond contract and would likely result in the obligee drawing down the full penal sum of the bond, leading to maximum financial exposure for the surety. Furthermore, such an action would violate regulatory expectations for prompt and responsible handling of claims and defaults, potentially leading to fines or disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to finance the principal without a rigorous assessment of the principal's ability to complete the project successfully. This could lead to further financial losses if the principal's underlying issues are not resolved. Ethically, this would be a failure to act in good faith, as it could expose the obligee to continued project delays and potential further defaults. A third incorrect approach would be to offer a settlement to the obligee that is significantly less than the cost of completion, without a proper understanding of the project's actual needs. This could be seen as an attempt to evade full responsibility and could lead to protracted legal disputes and reputational damage. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured process. First, the surety must conduct an immediate and thorough investigation of the default, gathering all relevant project documentation and assessing the principal's financial and operational capacity. Second, the surety should engage in open communication with the obligee to understand their priorities and expectations. Third, the surety must analyze the costs and risks associated with each potential option, financing the principal, arranging for completion by a third party, or tendering the contract. This analysis should consider not only direct costs, but also potential indirect costs such as legal fees and reputational damage. Finally, the surety should select the option that best aligns with its contractual obligations, regulatory requirements, and ethical responsibilities, aiming for the most efficient and effective resolution for all parties involved. Question 3. To address the challenge of a surety underwriter evaluating a contractor's financial health and operational capacity for a large public works project, which of the following approaches best demonstrates a comprehensive understanding of the various surety bond types and their specific protections for the obligee and the surety? Option A. Focusing solely on the contractor's ability to secure a performance bond, as this is the primary instrument guaranteeing project completion. Option B. Relying on the contractor's general reputation and assuming that a single broad surety policy will cover all potential liabilities. Option C. Verifying the presence and understanding the specific coverage of a bid bond, performance bond, payment bond, and maintenance bond, recognizing that each addresses distinct risks and obligations within the project lifecycle. Option D. Prioritizing the contractor's ability to obtain a supply bond, assuming that securing materials and equipment is the most critical factor for project success. The correct answer is A. Focusing solely on the contractor's ability to secure a performance bond, as this is the primary instrument guaranteeing project completion. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a surety underwriter must accurately assess the risk associated with a contractor's ability to fulfill multiple contractual obligations, each secured by different types of surety bonds. Misunderstanding the purpose and scope of each bond type can lead to inadequate collateralization, incorrect risk assessment, and potential financial losses for the surety. The underwriter must demonstrate a deep understanding of the specific protections each bond offers to the obligee and the surety. The correct approach involves recognizing that a contractor's default on a construction project can manifest in different ways, requiring distinct surety instrument to mitigate those specific risks. A bid bond protects the obligee against the bidder withdrawing their bid or failing to enter into the contract if awarded. A performance bond guarantees the completion of the contract according to its terms. A payment bond ensures that subcontractors and material suppliers are paid. A maintenance bond covers defects that appear after project completion. A supply bond guarantees the delivery of materials or equipment. A subdivision bond ensures the completion of public improvements in a development. The underwriter's role is to ensure that the surety's exposure is appropriately managed by understanding which bond is in place for which obligation and the implications of a default under each. This aligns with the fundamental principles of surety underwriting, which mandate a thorough understanding of the contractual obligations and the surety instruments designed to secure them, ensuring compliance with regulatory expectations for prudent risk management. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a single performance bond covers all potential contractor failures on a project. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the distinct purposes of various contract surety bonds. For instance, a performance bond does not guarantee payment to subcontractors. That is the role of a payment bond. Failing to recognize this distinction could leave unpaid subcontractors without recourse, potentially leading to liens and further complications for the project and the surety. Similarly, assuming a payment bond covers project completion is incorrect. It only addresses payment obligations. Another incorrect approach would be to overlook the importance of a maintenance bond, which provides protection against latent defects discovered after the project's formal acceptance. Ignoring this bond type leaves the obligee exposed to repair costs for issues that may not become apparent until well after the primary construction phase. Such oversights indicate a failure to adhere to the diligent underwriting practices expected by regulatory bodies overseeing the surety industry. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive review of all contractual documents and associated surety instruments. This involves identifying each specific obligation of the principal, the contractor, and the corresponding surety bond in place to secure that obligation. The underwriter must then assess the principal's capacity and character in relation to each specific risk. This systematic approach ensures that all potential exposures are identified and appropriately managed, aligning with regulatory requirements for sound underwriting and ethical conduct. Question 4. Analysis of a contractor's application for a significant contract surety bond reveals a concerning upward trend in their lost time injury frequency rate over the past 3 years, accompanied by several minor OSHA citations. The contractor's representative attributes these issues to a period of rapid growth and workforce expansion, asserting that they have recently implemented a comprehensive new safety training program and appointed a dedicated safety manager. As a surety underwriter, What is the most prudent and ethically sound approach to evaluating this application? Option A. Approve the bond application with a modest premium increase to compensate for the perceived increased risk, without further detailed investigation into the new safety initiatives. Option B. Decline the bond application outright due to the negative safety trend, as it indicates a systemic failure in risk management that poses an unacceptable risk to the surety. Option C. Request detailed documentation and evidence of the new safety training program's effectiveness, including training logs, safety committee minutes, and a review of the new safety manager's qualifications and implementation plan before making a decision. Option D. Approve the bond application based solely on the contractor's assurances that they are committed to improving their safety record and have taken steps to do so. The correct answer is B. Decline the bond application outright due to the negative safety trend, as it indicates a systemic failure in risk management that poses an unacceptable risk to the surety. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for a surety bond with the long-term implications of a contractor's safety record. The surety underwriter must exercise sound judgment to avoid exposing the surety to undue risk, while also acting ethically and in accordance with regulatory expectations. The core tension lies in the potential for a contractor with a concerning safety history to still be a viable risk if robust risk management practices are in place and demonstrable improvements are being made. The correct approach involves a thorough due diligence process that goes beyond simply reviewing lagging indicators like incident rates. It requires engaging with the contractor to understand the root causes of past incidents, evaluating the effectiveness of their current safety programs, and assessing their commitment to continuous improvement. This approach aligns with the principles of prudent underwriting, which mandates a comprehensive risk assessment. Regulatory frameworks for surety underwriting, such as those overseen by state insurance departments in the U.S., emphasize the importance of assessing the applicant's financial stability, character, and capacity, all of which are directly impacted by their safety performance and risk management. A proactive and investigative stance, seeking verifiable evidence of improved safety practices, is ethically sound and professionally responsible, as it protects the surety's financial integrity and upholds the principle of acting with due care. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the bond solely based on a negative trend in safety statistics without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that a contractor's safety record is a dynamic element that can be improved through effective management. Ethically, this approach could be seen as unfair to a contractor making genuine efforts to rectify past issues. From a regulatory perspective, it might not fully satisfy the requirement for a comprehensive risk assessment if it relies on a superficial interpretation of data. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the bond without adequately scrutinizing the contractor's safety program and risk management practices, perhaps due to pressure to meet business targets or a desire to avoid difficult conversations. This represents a failure in due diligence and a disregard for the potential for future claims arising from inadequate safety measures. Such an approach exposes the surety to significant financial risk and could be viewed as a violation of regulatory mandates requiring sound underwriting practices. A third incorrect approach would be to approve the bond with only superficial assurances from the contractor about future improvements, without seeking concrete evidence or establishing clear performance benchmarks. This approach lacks the rigor necessary for effective risk management and could be seen as a dereliction of the underwriter's duty to protect the surety's interests. It fails to establish a basis for ongoing monitoring and accountability, leaving the surety vulnerable to unforeseen losses. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, gather all available data on the contractor's safety record, including incident rates, workers' compensation claims, and OSHA violations. Second, engage in open communication with the contractor to understand the context of their safety performance and to inquire about their risk management strategies. Third, critically evaluate the contractor's proposed corrective actions and their commitment to implementing them, seeking verifiable evidence of progress. Fourth, consider the potential impact of the safety record on the contractor's overall financial capacity and operational stability. Finally, make a decision based on a holistic assessment of risk, considering the surety's appetite for risk and the potential for mitigation, always adhering to regulatory requirements and ethical principles. Question 5. The investigation demonstrates that a principal submitted a bid for a public works project and was awarded the contract. Subsequently, the principal refused to execute the contract, citing unforeseen cost increases not contemplated in their bid. The obligee has submitted a claim on the bid bond for the difference between the principal's bid and the next lowest responsive bid. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach for the surety? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation to determine if the principal's refusal to execute the contract constitutes a default under the terms of the bid bond and the underlying bid documents, and assess the obligee's claimed damages against the bond penalty. Option B. Advise the obligee that the surety is not responsible for market fluctuations or unforeseen cost increases that impact a principal's ability to perform. Option C. Immediately pay the claim to the obligee as the principal has refused to execute the contract, fulfilling the surety's obligation. Option D. Deny the claim outright, as the principal's refusal to execute the contract is a clear indication of their inability to perform, and the surety is not obligated to cover such situations. The correct answer is C. Immediately pay the claim to the obligee as the principal has refused to execute the contract, fulfilling the surety's obligation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety underwriter to navigate the complexities of a bid bond claim where the principal's default is not immediately clear-cut. The challenge lies in balancing the surety's obligation to the obligee with the principal's right to contest the default, all while adhering to the specific contractual terms and applicable regulatory framework for contract surety in the relevant jurisdiction. A thorough risk assessment is paramount to avoid erroneous claim payment or unjustified denial, both of which carry significant financial and reputational consequences. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the bid documents, the principal's performance, and the obligee's claim, focusing on establishing clear evidence of default as defined by the bid bond and underlying contract. This includes verifying that the principal failed to enter into the contract after being awarded the bid, or that their bid was demonstrably non-compliant in a way that constitutes a default. The surety must then assess the damages claimed by the obligee against the penal sum of the bond and the principal's potential defenses. This methodical process aligns with the surety's duty to act in good faith and fair dealing, preventing unwarranted payouts while fulfilling its contractual obligations to the obligee. An incorrect approach would be to immediately pay the claim based solely on the obligee's assertion of default, without independent verification. This fails to uphold the surety's responsibility to its principal and could lead to a wrongful payment, violating the principle of prudent underwriting and potentially breaching the surety agreement with the principal. Another incorrect approach is to summarily deny the claim without a thorough investigation into the facts and the contract terms. This could expose the surety to liability for bad faith denial if the principal or obligee can demonstrate that a default did, in fact, occur and the surety failed to act reasonably. A third incorrect approach is to rely on assumptions or industry hearsay rather than concrete evidence. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the rigorous standards expected in surety claims handling. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured approach. First, understand the contractual obligations and the specific terms of the bid bond. Second, gather all relevant documentation from both the principal and the obligee. Third, conduct an objective investigation to determine if a default has occurred according to the contract. Fourth, assess the validity and quantum of the obligee's damages. And finally, make a reasoned decision based on the evidence and the applicable legal and contractual framework, communicating the decision clearly to all parties. Question 6. During the evaluation of a principal's default on a construction contract, after receiving notice of the default from the obligee, what is the most prudent and legally sound initial course of action for the surety to undertake before committing to any specific remedy? Option A. Advise the principal to cease all work immediately and await further instructions from the surety. Option B. Demand immediate reimbursement from all indemnitors for the full potential exposure under the bond. Option C. Immediately tender performance of the contract to the obligee to fulfill the surety's obligations. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the circumstances of the default, the principal's financial condition, and the feasibility of various remedial options. The correct answer is C. Immediately tender performance of the contract to the obligee to fulfill the surety's obligations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the surety faces competing obligations and potential financial exposure. The principal's default triggers the surety's obligations under the contract, but the surety also has a duty to act prudently to mitigate its losses and protect its interests, which may include the rights of indemnitors. The decision-making process requires a careful assessment of the principal's financial condition, the terms of the surety bond, the underlying contract, and applicable state laws governing surety relationships and remedies. A hasty or ill-informed decision can lead to significant financial detriment for the surety and potential legal disputes. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the default and the principal's circumstances, followed by a strategic decision to either perform the contract, finance the principal's completion, or tender the performance to the obligee. This approach aligns with the surety's fundamental role as a guarantor and its right to mitigate damages. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing insurance and suretyship, generally permit and encourage such proactive measures to manage risk and fulfill obligations efficiently. Ethically, this demonstrates a commitment to resolving the situation responsibly. An incorrect approach would be to immediately abandon the principal and refuse to acknowledge any obligation without a comprehensive review. This failure to investigate and explore available remedies could be seen as a breach of the surety's implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, potentially violating state insurance regulations that mandate fair claims handling practices. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to finance the principal's completion without securing adequate collateral or a clear plan for repayment, exposing the surety to undue financial risk and potentially violating prudent underwriting and risk management principles. A third incorrect approach would be to tender performance to the obligee without first exploring whether the principal could complete the work with the surety's assistance, which might be a more cost-effective solution and preserve the principal's business. This could be viewed as an abdication of the surety's responsibility to manage the claim effectively. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a detailed factual investigation. This includes reviewing the bond, the principal's financial statements, and communications with the obligee and principal. Next, they should analyze the available options in light of the investigation, considering the potential financial implications, legal ramifications, and impact on the surety's reputation. Consultation with legal counsel specializing in surety law is often crucial. The decision should be documented thoroughly, outlining the rationale and the chosen course of action. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal that a surety professional, while handling a claim on a performance bond, has become aware of a potential defense that could significantly reduce or eliminate the principal's liability. However, the principal is actively discouraging the surety from investigating this defense, suggesting it would be detrimental to their business relationship and potentially expose other undisclosed issues. The surety professional believes the principal may be withholding crucial information that supports this defense. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surety professional in this ethically challenging situation? Option A. Inform the principal that the surety will proceed with investigating the potential defense independently, gathering all necessary information, and will assert any valid defenses found, regardless of the principal's wishes. Option B. Cease all communication and involvement in the claim, considering the situation too complex and potentially damaging to the surety's relationship with the principal. Option C. Advise the obligee that the principal has indicated a potential defense, but refrain from further investigation or assertion of the defense due to the principal's objections, leaving the obligee to pursue legal action to uncover the defense. Option D. Proceed with the claim payment as demanded by the obligee, without further investigation into the potential defense, to maintain a smooth relationship with the obligee and avoid conflict with the principal. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the claim payment as demanded by the obligee, without further investigation into the potential defense, to maintain a smooth relationship with the obligee and avoid conflict with the principal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the surety professional is aware of a potential defense that could shield their principal from liability, but the principal is actively trying to conceal information that would support this defense. The surety's duty is to act in good faith towards both the principal and the obligee, and this situation creates a conflict between those duties. The surety must balance its obligation to protect its principal from unjust claims with its obligation to the obligee to ensure performance. The professional challenge lies in navigating this conflict ethically and legally, without compromising the integrity of the surety relationship or violating regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves the surety investigating the potential defense thoroughly and transparently, even if the principal is uncooperative. This means gathering all available evidence, including information the principal may be withholding, and assessing its validity. If the defense is found to be legitimate and applicable under the contract and governing law, the surety has a professional and ethical obligation to assert it. This approach aligns with the principles of good faith and fair dealing inherent in surety contracts and is supported by general principles of contract law, which recognize valid defenses. Regulatory frameworks for contract surety often emphasize the importance of due diligence and acting in a manner that upholds the integrity of the surety market. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential defense simply because the principal is resistant to its exploration. This failure to investigate a known potential defense constitutes a breach of the surety's duty of good faith and could expose the surety to liability for failing to act diligently. It also undermines the principle that defenses validly available to the principal should be considered. Another incorrect approach would be to capitulate to the principal's wishes and not pursue the defense, even if it appears valid. This would be a failure to uphold the surety's responsibilities and could lead to an unjust outcome for the obligee. Finally, actively assisting the principal in concealing information related to the defense would be a severe ethical and regulatory violation, potentially constituting fraud or misrepresentation. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the facts, the relevant contract terms, and applicable laws and regulations. Professionals must prioritize ethical conduct, including honesty and transparency, and act with due diligence. When faced with conflicting interests, seeking legal counsel is often advisable to ensure compliance with all obligations and to navigate complex legal and ethical terrain. The ultimate goal is to reach a resolution that is fair, legally sound, and upholds the integrity of the surety industry. Question 8. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a contractor has a significant project backlog. From a stakeholder perspective, which of the following approaches to analyzing this backlog is most aligned with prudent surety underwriting principles and regulatory expectations for assessing a contractor's capacity and financial stability? Option A. Reviewing the total dollar value of the backlog to determine the contractor's market presence and potential for future revenue growth. Option B. Evaluating the contractor's ability to execute the entire backlog, considering project specifics, profitability, financial capacity, and management depth. Option C. Assuming that all projects within the backlog are of similar risk and profitability, and that the contractor can manage them effectively based on their historical volume of work. Option D. Focusing on the contractor's sales pipeline and potential future contract awards to gauge the long-term viability of their business. Correct answer is A. Reviewing the total dollar value of the backlog to determine the contractor's market presence and potential for future revenue growth. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety underwriter to interpret a contractor's project backlog not just as a list of future work, but as a critical indicator of financial health and operational capacity. The challenge lies in discerning the true risk embedded within the backlog, which can be obscured by optimistic projections, poorly defined scopes, or unproven subcontractor relationships. Careful judgment is required to avoid overcommitting surety capacity to contractors who may be overextended or whose future profitability is uncertain, thereby protecting the surety from potential losses. The correct approach involves a comprehensive analysis of the contractor's ability to successfully execute the entire backlog, considering factors such as financial strength, management depth, operational efficiency, and the nature of the projects themselves. This includes scrutinizing the profitability of existing contracts, the reasonableness of future revenue projections, and the contractor's historical performance in managing similar workloads. Regulatory frameworks for surety underwriting, such as those overseen by state insurance departments in the U.S., emphasize prudent risk management and the need for underwriters to have a sound basis for assessing a contractor's capacity and financial stability. Ethically, underwriters have a duty to their principals and the surety company to avoid taking on undue risk. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the total dollar value of the backlog as a primary indicator of a contractor's strength. This fails to account for the inherent risks and uncertainties associated with future projects and ignores the contractor's actual capacity to absorb and execute that work. Such an approach could lead to an underestimation of risk, violating the principle of prudent underwriting, and potentially exposing the surety to significant losses, which could have regulatory implications if it leads to financial instability for the surety. Another incorrect approach is to assume that all backlog projects are equally profitable and low risk. This overlooks the critical need to assess the specific nature of each project, including its complexity, the client's payment history, and the contractor's experience with similar work. Failing to differentiate between project types and associated risks is a significant oversight in risk assessment and can lead to mispricing of surety bonds and inadequate reserves. A third incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the contractor's sales pipeline without adequately verifying the existence of signed contracts and the likelihood of those contracts being awarded. A backlog should represent committed work, not speculative opportunities. Relying on a sales pipeline without due diligence on contract execution and financial viability is a failure to adhere to sound underwriting principles and could result in the surety extending capacity based on unrealistic expectations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should prioritize understanding the contractor's operational and financial capacity in relation to their current and projected workload. Key steps include 1. Obtaining detailed backlog reports with project specifics, contract values, and estimated completion dates. 2. Analyzing the profitability and risk profile of each project within the backlog. 3. Assessing the contractor's historical performance in managing similar backlogs. 4. Evaluating the contractor's financial statements in conjunction with their backlog to ensure adequate working capital and liquidity. And 5. Considering the contractor's management team and their ability to oversee the projected workload. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are based on a thorough understanding of the risks involved, aligning with regulatory expectations and ethical obligations. Question 9. Comparative studies suggest that surety professionals often face challenges in determining the precise legal and regulatory framework governing contract surety bonds, particularly when a project involves multiple governmental entities or falls under varying state statutes. In a scenario where a surety is asked to issue a bond for a construction project that involves improvements to a facility owned by a state university, but managed by a private entity under a long-term lease agreement, which approach best ensures compliance with the legal and regulatory framework governing contract surety? Option A. Assuming that because a private entity is managing the project, it falls under private construction bond requirements, regardless of the underlying public ownership of the facility. Option B. Relying on the general understanding of public work as defined in federal statutes, assuming it applies universally to state and quasi-governmental projects. Option C. Prioritizing the terms of the surety company's standard bond forms, as these are designed to encompass most regulatory requirements. Option D. Conducting a thorough review of the specific state statutes where the project is located to determine the definition of public work and the applicable notice requirements for claimants, while also considering the terms of the lease agreement and the specific nature of the entity managing the project. The correct answer is B. Relying on the general understanding of public work as defined in federal statutes, assuming it applies universally to state and quasi-governmental projects. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a surety professional to navigate the complex interplay between federal and state regulations governing surety bonds, specifically concerning the definition of public work and the associated notice requirements for subcontractors. Misinterpreting these definitions can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions, including the potential invalidation of a surety's claim or liability. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the applicable legal framework and ensuring compliance with all statutory requirements, which can vary significantly between jurisdictions. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of both federal statutes, if applicable, such as the Miller Act for federal projects, and the specific state statutes where the project is located. This includes understanding how each jurisdiction defines public work and the precise notice requirements for subcontractors to preserve their rights against the surety. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principle that surety bonds are creatures of statute, and strict compliance with statutory requirements is essential for their enforceability. Failure to adhere to these specific notice provisions can render a claim invalid, directly impacting the surety's obligations and the rights of claimants. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a single definition of public work, or a uniform set of notice requirements, applies across all projects, regardless of location or project type. This overlooks the critical principle of state-level regulatory authority over many construction projects. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on industry custom or practice without verifying it against the explicit statutory language. This is a regulatory failure because industry custom cannot override or supersede statutory mandates. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed of processing over thorough legal review, leading to a superficial assessment of notice requirements. This is an ethical and regulatory failure as it compromises the professional duty to ensure compliance and protect the surety from undue liability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the project's jurisdiction and type. This triggers a detailed review of the relevant federal and state statutes governing public works and surety bonds. The next step is to meticulously analyze the specific notice provisions within those statutes, paying close attention to definitions, timelines, and required content. If any ambiguity exists, seeking legal counsel specializing in construction surety law is paramount. This systematic, legally grounded approach ensures compliance and mitigates risk. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that the principal contractor on a federal construction project has made several payments to a supplier for materials that the auditor has flagged as potentially outside the direct scope of the project's immediate construction needs, though the contractor asserts they were necessary for overall project completion. As the surety, what is the most appropriate course of action to determine the validity of these payments under the payment bond? Option A. Immediately deny coverage for all flagged payments as they are not directly tied to immediate construction needs, as per the auditor's preliminary assessment. Option B. Advise the auditor that payment bond coverage is solely determined by the contractor's discretion and is not subject to surety review for materials deemed necessary for overall project completion. Option C. Accept the contractor's assurance that all payments were necessary for project completion without further inquiry, as the contractor is the principal obligor. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation to verify if the materials supplied were indeed used for the prosecution of the work on the federal project, as defined by the Miller Act, and review relevant invoices and delivery confirmations. The correct answer is A. Immediately deny coverage for all flagged payments as they are not directly tied to immediate construction needs, as per the auditor's preliminary assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the purpose and function of payment bonds within the context of contract surety, specifically as governed by U.S. federal regulations, Miller Act, as it pertains to federal projects. The auditor's findings highlight a potential misapplication of funds, which directly implicates the surety's obligations and the protection afforded to unpaid subcontractors and suppliers. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate project costs and those that fall outside the scope of payment bond coverage, necessitating a thorough review of the bond's terms and applicable law. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous examination of the payment bond's language and the relevant provisions of the Miller Act. This approach is right because the Miller Act explicitly defines the scope of protection offered by payment bonds on federal public works projects. It mandates that these bonds protect persons supplying the principal or his or her subcontractors with labor or materials for the prosecution of the work. Therefore, verifying if the disputed payments were for labor or materials furnished for the specific federal project is the primary determinant of coverage. This aligns with the fundamental purpose of payment bonds, to ensure that those who contribute labor and materials to a public project are paid, thereby preventing liens on public property and ensuring project continuity. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to automatically deny coverage for any payment dispute identified by the auditor without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the protective intent of the payment bond and the statutory requirements of the Miller Act. It presumes fault or ineligibility without due diligence, potentially leaving deserving claimants unpaid and violating the spirit and letter of the law. Another incorrect approach would be to approve all payments flagged by the auditor as project-related without independent verification. This abdicates the surety's responsibility to ensure that payments are made in accordance with the bond's terms and the underlying contract. It risks the surety paying for items not covered by the bond or for work not performed, exposing the surety to undue financial risk and potentially facilitating fraudulent claims. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the contractor's assertion that the payments were for the project, without corroborating evidence. The contractor has a vested interest in minimizing their own financial exposure. The surety's duty is to act prudently and independently, verifying claims against the bond's coverage and legal requirements, not simply accepting the principal's word. This approach neglects the surety's fiduciary responsibility to its obligees and its own financial solvency. Professional reasoning. Professionals in contract surety must adopt a systematic and legally informed decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the specific bond and its governing statutes, in this case, the Miller Act for federal projects. 2. Identifying the nature of the claim or payment in question. 3. Verifying if the labor or materials were furnished for the prosecution of the work covered by the bond. 4. Assessing the validity of the claim based on contractual terms and legal precedent. 5. Communicating findings and decisions clearly and transparently to all parties involved. This structured approach ensures compliance with regulatory frameworks, upholds ethical obligations, and protects the interests of all stakeholders. Question 11. Investigation of a subcontractor's claim against a payment bond for unpaid work on a state-funded highway project requires determining the most effective method to preserve the subcontractor's right to recovery. The subcontractor has provided preliminary notice to the general contractor and the state transportation department. What is the critical next step to ensure the subcontractor's statutory payment bond rights are protected? Option A. Filing a claim directly with the state transportation department. Option B. Filing a lawsuit against the general contractor for breach of contract. Option C. Adhering to the specific notice and filing deadlines stipulated by the applicable state Little Miller Act for initiating legal action on the bond. Option D. Sending a demand letter to the surety company for payment. Correct answer is B. Filing a lawsuit against the general contractor for breach of contract. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the interplay between common law principles and statutory payment bond rights, particularly when a claimant seeks recovery. The claimant must navigate the specific notice requirements and filing deadlines mandated by the relevant statute, which often supersedes or modifies common law remedies. Failure to adhere strictly to these statutory provisions can result in the forfeiture of the right to claim against the bond, even if a valid debt exists under common law. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying the applicable statute, understanding its precise requirements, and ensuring all procedural steps are meticulously followed within the prescribed timelines. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the specific statutory payment bond provisions applicable to the project. This includes identifying the governing statute, e.g., Miller Act for federal projects, Little Miller Acts for state projects, determining the claimant's status, e.g., direct contractor, subcontractor, material supplier, and meticulously adhering to all notice requirements, e.g., preliminary notice, notice of claim, and filing deadlines for any lawsuit. This approach is correct because statutory payment bonds are creatures of statute, and their remedies are strictly construed. Compliance with the statutory framework is the sole basis for establishing a right to recover. This ensures the claimant preserves their legal rights and avoids procedural bars to recovery. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on common law principles of unjust enrichment or quantum merit without first satisfying the statutory notice and filing requirements. This is incorrect because statutory payment bonds create specific rights and obligations that are distinct from, and often more restrictive than, common law remedies. The statute provides the exclusive mechanism for recovery against the bond, and bypassing its procedural prerequisites renders the claim invalid. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that sending a general invoice or demand letter to the principal contractor is sufficient to preserve rights under the payment bond. This is incorrect because statutory payment bond laws typically require specific forms of notice, delivered in a prescribed manner and within strict timeframes, to inform the surety and obligee of the claim. A generic demand letter, even if timely sent, may not meet these specific statutory requirements. A further incorrect approach would be to delay filing a lawsuit until after the statutory deadline has passed, believing that common law statutes of limitations would apply. This is incorrect because payment bond statutes establish their own specific periods of limitations for filing suit, which are typically shorter than general statutes of limitations. Missing this statutory deadline extinguishes the right to sue on the bond. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the project contract, identification of the applicable payment bond statute, careful analysis of the claimant's position within the statutory framework, and strict adherence to all notice and filing deadlines. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel specializing in construction law and surety is paramount to ensure compliance and protect the claimant's rights. Question 12. The assessment process reveals that a principal has defaulted on a bonded contract, and the obligee is demanding performance and payment under the surety bond. The surety has secured indemnity agreements from the principal and its shareholders. What is the most appropriate course of action for the surety to protect its interests and fulfill its obligations? Option A. Pay the obligee's full demand without further investigation, assuming the indemnity agreements will cover any resulting losses. Option B. Inform the indemnitors that they are immediately liable for the full amount of the bond and demand payment without first assessing the principal's default or the obligee's actual losses. Option C. Advise the obligee that the surety is not responsible for the principal's default and suggest the obligee pursue legal action directly against the principal. Option D. Immediately investigate the principal's default and the obligee's claim, assessing the extent of the loss and the surety's potential liability, while simultaneously evaluating its rights and options under the indemnity agreements to seek recovery from the principal and indemnitors. The correct answer is D. Immediately investigate the principal's default and the obligee's claim, assessing the extent of the loss and the surety's potential liability, while simultaneously evaluating its rights and options under the indemnity agreements to seek recovery from the principal and indemnitors. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a surety bond is in place for a construction project. The principal contractor has encountered significant financial difficulties, leading to a potential default on their obligations. The obligee project owner is concerned about project completion and is exploring options to recover losses. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires the surety to balance its obligations to the obligee with its rights and responsibilities towards the principal and any indemnitors. Navigating these competing interests while adhering to regulatory frameworks is crucial. The correct approach involves the surety undertaking a thorough investigation into the principal's default and the extent of the obligee's potential losses. This investigation should inform the surety's decision on how to best mitigate damages, which may include stepping in to complete the project, arranging for a replacement contractor, or negotiating a settlement with the obligee. This aligns with the surety's contractual obligations under the bond and its rights under the indemnity agreements. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing surety operations, typically require the surety to act in good faith and to manage its liabilities prudently. The indemnity agreements, which are a cornerstone of surety underwriting, provide the surety with recourse against the principal and indemnitors for any losses incurred. Therefore, the surety must diligently pursue its rights under these agreements to recover its expenditures. An incorrect approach would be for the surety to immediately abandon the project without investigation, leaving the obligee to manage the fallout. This would breach the surety's duty to the obligee under the bond and could expose the surety to significant liability. Another incorrect approach would be for the surety to pay the obligee's claim in full without assessing the validity or extent of the loss, and without considering its rights of subrogation or indemnity. This would be financially imprudent and could violate regulatory requirements for sound financial management. Furthermore, attempting to unilaterally modify the terms of the indemnity agreement without the consent of the indemnitors would be a violation of contract law and could invalidate the surety's recourse. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific terms of the surety bond and the indemnity agreements. A systematic investigation into the default and damages is paramount. This should be followed by a strategic decision-making process that considers all available options for loss mitigation and recovery, always in compliance with applicable regulations and contractual obligations. Open communication with the obligee and indemnitors, while respecting confidentiality, is also a key element of professional conduct. Question 13. Operational review demonstrates that the contractor's proposed project manager for a complex infrastructure project has a strong financial history, but limited direct experience managing projects of this specific scale and technical complexity. The contractor has provided resumes for key personnel, but the depth of their experience on similar projects is not immediately apparent from the documentation. What is the most prudent course of action for the surety underwriter? Option A. Issue the performance bond based on the contractor's overall financial strength, assuming the project manager will learn on the job. Option B. Request detailed project histories and references for the proposed project manager and other key personnel, and conduct interviews to thoroughly assess their relevant experience and capabilities for this specific project. Option C. Decline to issue the bond, citing the project manager's lack of direct experience, without further investigation into the capabilities of the broader project team. Option D. Accept the contractor's assurances that their team is capable and proceed with issuing the bond, relying on the contractor's general reputation. The correct answer is B. Request detailed project histories and references for the proposed project manager and other key personnel, and conduct interviews to thoroughly assess their relevant experience and capabilities for this specific project. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the surety underwriter must balance the need to secure a performance bond with the obligation to ensure the contractor possesses the requisite experience and expertise. Overlooking deficiencies in personnel experience can lead to project failure, default, and significant financial loss for the surety. Conversely, demanding unrealistic or unattainable experience levels could unfairly exclude a capable contractor. The core challenge lies in objectively assessing the contractor's team against the project's demands and the surety's risk tolerance, adhering strictly to the contract surety exam's regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment of the contractor's proposed project management and key personnel against the specific requirements of the bonded project. This includes verifying their track record on similar projects, their technical qualifications, and their demonstrated ability to manage complex construction operations. Regulatory frameworks for contract surety underwriting emphasize prudent risk assessment, which inherently requires a deep understanding of the contractor's capacity. This approach aligns with the principle of underwriting based on demonstrated competence and experience, minimizing the likelihood of default. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the contractor's self-certification of experience without independent verification. This fails to meet the surety's duty of due diligence and exposes the surety to undue risk, potentially violating underwriting guidelines that mandate robust verification of a contractor's qualifications. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the contractor based on a minor, easily rectifiable experience gap without exploring mitigation strategies. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and an unwillingness to engage in constructive risk management, potentially leading to the rejection of a viable contractor. Finally, accepting vague assurances about personnel expertise without concrete evidence of their qualifications or past performance on comparable projects is a significant failure. This bypasses the fundamental requirement of assessing a contractor's ability to perform the bonded obligation, leaving the surety exposed to substantial risk. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the project's scope and complexity. This understanding then informs the specific experience and expertise required from the contractor's personnel. The next step is to rigorously evaluate the contractor's submitted information, seeking corroborating evidence and conducting interviews where necessary. If gaps are identified, the professional should explore potential mitigation strategies, such as requiring additional support personnel, specific training, or a revised project plan. The final decision must be based on a comprehensive risk assessment, documented thoroughly, and aligned with the surety's underwriting appetite and regulatory obligations. Question 14. The review process indicates that a surety underwriter is evaluating the equipment and resource capacity of a principal for a significant construction project. The underwriter has reviewed the principal's provided list of owned equipment and has noted the availability of several large construction firms in the region that could potentially supply any additional equipment needed. The underwriter is considering approving the bond based on this information. Which of the following best represents the most prudent and compliant approach to evaluating the principal's equipment and resource capacity in this scenario? Option A. Relying on the principal's assurance that they have access to sufficient equipment and resources, and conducting a cursory review of their financial statements to confirm general solvency, without delving into the specifics of their operational capabilities or contingency planning for equipment needs. Option B. Accepting the principal's self-reported inventory of owned equipment as sufficient and assuming that any required additional equipment can be readily leased from local suppliers due to the general availability of such services in the region. Option C. Verifying the condition, maintenance records, and specific suitability of the principal's owned equipment for the project, and assessing the principal's demonstrated ability to secure and manage necessary additional equipment and resources through a review of their procurement strategies and financial capacity to engage third-party providers. Option D. Focusing primarily on the quantity of equipment listed by the principal and the general reputation of the principal's ability to manage large projects without detailed investigation into the specific condition or maintenance of their existing assets or their plans for acquiring additional resources. The correct answer is C. Verifying the condition, maintenance records, and specific suitability of the principal's owned equipment for the project, and assessing the principal's demonstrated ability to secure and manage necessary additional equipment and resources through a review of their procurement strategies and financial capacity to engage third-party providers. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential discrepancy in how a surety underwriter is evaluating the equipment and resources of a principal for a large infrastructure project. This scenario is professionally challenging because the underwriter must balance the need for thorough due diligence with the practical realities of project timelines and the principal's operational capacity. A misjudgment in evaluating equipment and resources can lead to underpricing the risk, resulting in significant financial losses for the surety if the principal defaults. Conversely, an overly conservative assessment might lead to unnecessarily high premiums or even the rejection of a viable project, impacting business relationships. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the principal's owned and leased equipment, considering its age, condition, maintenance records, and suitability for the specific project requirements. This evaluation must also extend to the principal's capacity to secure necessary additional equipment and resources, including labor and materials, through reliable third-party arrangements. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing surety underwriting practices, emphasize the importance of assessing the principal's capacity and financial stability, which are directly linked to their ability to execute the bonded obligation. This includes ensuring that the principal possesses or can readily access the necessary tools and personnel to complete the work as contracted. Ethical considerations also dictate that the underwriter acts with prudence and diligence, avoiding assumptions and seeking verifiable evidence of the principal's capabilities. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the principal's self-reported inventory of equipment without independent verification, or to assume that the principal can easily acquire any necessary additional resources without assessing their procurement capabilities and financial capacity to do so. This failure to conduct independent due diligence contravenes the principle of prudent underwriting and could lead to a material misrepresentation of the risk. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the quantity of equipment without considering its quality, maintenance, or appropriateness for the project, which neglects a critical aspect of operational readiness and could expose the surety to unforeseen project delays and cost overruns. Furthermore, overlooking the principal's ability to manage and maintain the equipment, or their contingency plans for equipment failure, represents a significant gap in risk assessment, as it fails to account for operational vulnerabilities. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with clearly defining the scope of the project and its specific equipment and resource demands. This should be followed by a systematic review of the principal's existing assets, including verification of ownership, condition, and utilization. Crucially, the assessment must extend to the principal's demonstrated ability to procure, manage, and maintain any additional resources required. This involves scrutinizing contracts with suppliers and subcontractors, evaluating the principal's financial capacity to meet these obligations, and understanding their operational track record. The underwriter must maintain professional skepticism, seeking corroborating evidence and challenging assumptions to ensure a robust and accurate risk assessment. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that a contractor has defaulted on a significant public works project, leading to substantial delays and potential cost overruns. The surety company, as the guarantor of performance, must determine the most appropriate course of action to fulfill its obligations to the obligee. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of contract surety and regulatory expectations for managing such defaults? Option A. Conduct a detailed assessment of the contractor's remaining work, financial resources, and the project's overall status to determine the most viable option between financing the original contractor to complete the work or securing a new contractor to finish the project. Option B. Immediately tender a settlement offer to the obligee for the estimated remaining contract value, regardless of the feasibility of project completion. Option C. Advise the obligee that the surety's obligation is limited to the bond penalty amount and that any further costs are the obligee's responsibility. Option D. Cease all communication with the obligee and principal while awaiting further instructions from legal counsel, irrespective of project timelines. The correct answer is B. Immediately tender a settlement offer to the obligee for the estimated remaining contract value, regardless of the feasibility of project completion. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a surety to balance the immediate financial implications of a contractor's default with its long-term obligations and the potential for reputational damage. The surety must act decisively to mitigate losses while adhering strictly to its contractual duties and regulatory requirements. The core challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate response mechanism under the surety bond agreement, which dictates the surety's rights and responsibilities upon default. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the contractor's financial and operational capacity, followed by a strategic decision to either finance the contractor to completion or to procure a substitute contractor. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the surety's obligation to protect the obligee from loss due to the principal's default, as stipulated in the surety bond and underlying contract. Regulatory frameworks for contract surety, such as those governing financial institutions and insurance, emphasize prudent risk management and the fulfillment of contractual promises. By considering both completion agreements and takeover agreements, the surety demonstrates a commitment to finding the most efficient and effective solution to ensure project completion, thereby upholding its fiduciary duty and maintaining market confidence. This aligns with the principle of acting in good faith and exercising due diligence in managing its surety portfolio. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally terminate the bond without a comprehensive investigation, or to offer a settlement that does not fully address the obligee's losses. Terminating the bond without proper cause or investigation could expose the surety to claims of bad faith and breach of contract, violating the fundamental principles of surety law and potentially leading to regulatory sanctions for failing to meet contractual obligations. Offering a settlement that undervalues the actual losses incurred by the obligee would also be a failure, as it would not fulfill the surety's promise to indemnify the obligee against loss and could result in regulatory scrutiny for unfair claims practices. Furthermore, delaying a decision or failing to engage with the obligee and principal in a timely manner can exacerbate project delays and increase overall costs, demonstrating a lack of professional diligence and potentially violating regulatory expectations for prompt claims handling. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, the surety must promptly acknowledge the default and initiate a thorough investigation into the principal's performance and financial status. Second, it must carefully review the terms of the surety bond and the underlying contract to understand its obligations and the rights of the obligee. Third, it should engage in open communication with all parties involved: the obligee, the principal, and any subcontractors or suppliers. Fourth, based on the investigation and contractual review, the surety must evaluate the feasibility and cost-effectiveness of various remedies, including financing the principal, procuring a substitute contractor, or negotiating a settlement. This structured approach ensures that the surety's actions are informed, compliant, and aligned with its contractual and regulatory responsibilities. Question 16. Assessment of the primary purpose of contract surety within the U.S. regulatory framework, considering its function in construction projects, leads to differing interpretations, Which of the following best defines the fundamental purpose of contract surety? Option A. To facilitate the contractor's ability to bid on larger projects by providing a general credit enhancement for their overall business operations. Option B. To serve as a direct financial loan to the contractor, enabling them to secure necessary working capital for project execution. Option C. To provide a guarantee to the obligee that the principal will perform the contract and pay for labor and materials, thereby mitigating the obligee's risk of contractor default. Option D. To offer financial protection to the contractor against unforeseen project costs or losses, functioning similarly to a contractor's own insurance policy. The correct answer is C. To provide a guarantee to the obligee that the principal will perform the contract and pay for labor and materials, thereby mitigating the obligee's risk of contractor default. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the fundamental purpose of contract surety bonds within the U.S. regulatory framework, specifically as it relates to the contract surety exam. Misinterpreting this purpose can lead to incorrect advice or assessments, potentially impacting project viability and stakeholder confidence. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between the surety's role and that of other project participants or financial instruments. The correct approach accurately identifies the primary purpose of contract surety as providing a guarantee of performance and payment to the obligee, typically the project owner, thereby mitigating risk for them. This aligns directly with the principles of contract surety as defined by U.S. law and industry practice, which emphasize the surety's role as a risk transfer mechanism and a financial guarantor of the contractor's obligations. The surety's involvement is not merely a loan or a guarantee of the contractor's financial success in a general sense, but a specific commitment to ensure the contract is completed and that subcontractors and suppliers are paid. This understanding is crucial for assessing the value and function of surety bonds in construction projects. An incorrect approach that views contract surety primarily as a form of insurance for the contractor fails to recognize the fundamental tripartite relationship. Insurance typically indemnifies the insured against their own losses, whereas a surety bond protects the obligee from the contractor's default. The surety's recourse is against the principal, the contractor, not the other way around, in the event of a claim. This mischaracterization is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it misrepresents the core function and risk allocation inherent in surety. Another incorrect approach that equates contract surety with a simple loan facility overlooks the conditional nature of the surety's obligation. A loan is a direct financial provision to the borrower. A surety bond is a contingent obligation that is triggered only upon the principal's default. The surety's underwriting process focuses on the principal's ability to perform the contract, not just their creditworthiness for a loan. Treating it as a loan ignores the performance guarantee aspect and the surety's right of subrogation and indemnity against the principal. This is a failure to adhere to the established legal and practical definitions of contract surety. A further incorrect approach that suggests contract surety's main purpose is to facilitate the contractor's access to capital without regard to performance obligations misrepresents the surety's risk management function. While surety bonds can indirectly help contractors secure projects and thus access capital through project earnings, their primary purpose is not to be a capital-raising tool for the contractor in isolation. The surety's commitment is tied to the successful completion of the contract and payment of labor and materials. Focusing solely on capital access without acknowledging the performance guarantee is a misinterpretation of the surety's role and a potential ethical lapse in advising stakeholders. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the core definition and purpose of contract surety as established by U.S. law and industry standards. This involves recognizing the tripartite relationship, principal, obligee, surety, the contingent nature of the surety's obligation, and the primary goal of protecting the obligee from contractor default. When evaluating scenarios, professionals should ask, does this understanding accurately reflect the surety's role in guaranteeing performance and payment to the obligee, and does it acknowledge the surety's recourse against the principal? This analytical lens ensures adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. Question 17. Upon reviewing a complex claim involving a performance bond where the principal disputes the claimant's entitlement to payment and the surety is facing pressure from both sides, which dispute resolution method should the surety prioritize as the initial structured approach to facilitate a resolution? Option A, arbitration. Option B, mediation. Option C, litigation. Option D, direct negotiation. Correct answer is B, mediation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a significant dispute between a surety, a principal, and a claimant, with potential financial and reputational ramifications for all parties. The surety's role as an intermediary and guarantor necessitates a balanced and legally sound approach to dispute resolution. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate method that aligns with contractual obligations, regulatory requirements, and the principles of fairness and efficiency. The correct approach is to pursue mediation. Mediation is a voluntary and confidential process where a neutral third party facilitates communication and negotiation between disputing parties to help them reach a mutually acceptable resolution. This approach is favored because it allows for flexibility, preserves relationships, and can be more cost-effective and time-efficient than other methods. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, mediation aligns with the surety's duty to act in good faith and to seek practical solutions that minimize losses while upholding contractual commitments. It empowers the parties to control the outcome, fostering a more sustainable resolution. Pursuing litigation as the initial step is an incorrect approach. While litigation is a formal legal process that can result in a binding judgment, it is often adversarial, time-consuming, and expensive. It can escalate conflict, damage business relationships, and lead to significant legal costs for all parties involved, potentially exceeding the value of the dispute itself. Ethically, initiating litigation without first exploring less adversarial options may be seen as an aggressive stance that does not prioritize efficient resolution or the preservation of business relationships, which can be contrary to the spirit of good faith dealings expected in surety relationships. Choosing arbitration as the immediate course of action is also an incorrect approach. Arbitration is a more formal process than mediation, involving a neutral arbitrator who makes a binding decision. While it can be faster and less formal than litigation, it is still a structured process with associated costs and can lead to a win-lose outcome, potentially damaging relationships. If the contract does not explicitly mandate arbitration for this type of dispute, unilaterally opting for it might bypass more collaborative and potentially less costly resolution methods, and could be seen as imposing a potentially unfavorable process on the other parties without exploring their preferences. Engaging in direct, unassisted negotiation without considering structured dispute resolution methods is an incomplete approach. While negotiation is often the first step in any dispute, in complex situations involving multiple parties and significant financial stakes, it may stall without the assistance of a neutral facilitator. Relying solely on direct negotiation might lead to an impasse, prolonged disagreements, and increased frustration, ultimately necessitating a more formal process. It fails to leverage the benefits of structured dispute resolution frameworks that are designed to overcome such impasses and facilitate more productive dialogue. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the dispute's nature, the contractual provisions regarding dispute resolution, the parties' willingness to cooperate, and the potential costs and benefits of each method. A tiered approach, starting with less formal and more collaborative methods like negotiation and mediation, and escalating to more formal processes like arbitration or litigation only when necessary, is generally the most prudent and professionally responsible course of action. This approach prioritizes efficiency, cost-effectiveness, and the preservation of relationships while ensuring that legal rights are protected. Question 18. Market research demonstrates that principals bonded for public infrastructure projects are increasingly facing financial distress due to unforeseen material cost escalations. A surety has been notified of a principal's default on a significant highway construction contract. The surety's internal analysis indicates that the principal has some remaining operational capacity, but is severely undercapitalized. The obligee, a state department of transportation, is demanding immediate action to ensure project completion. The surety is considering its options, continuing to finance the principal's operations to complete the project, undertaking the completion of the project itself with its own resources, or soliciting bids from other contractors to complete the work. Which of the following approaches, if implemented without proper due diligence and risk assessment, would most likely expose the surety to the greatest potential for unforeseen financial losses and regulatory scrutiny due to a failure to act in the best interests of all parties involved. Option A. Financing the principal's continued operations with strict oversight and performance milestones. Option B. Undertaking the completion of the contract directly using the surety's own management and labor resources. Option C. Soliciting competitive bids from qualified third-party contractors for project completion and overseeing the selected contractor. Option D. Immediately tendering the contract to the principal's largest competitor without competitive bidding to expedite completion. The correct answer is A. Financing the principal's continued operations with strict oversight and performance milestones. Explanation: this scenario presents a common yet complex challenge for a surety. The principal's default on a bonded contract triggers the surety's obligations and necessitates a strategic response to mitigate losses and fulfill its contractual commitments. The challenge lies in balancing the surety's financial interests with its duty to the obligee and the principles of contract law governing surety relationships. Each potential option carries distinct legal, financial, and reputational implications. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the principal's financial health and the project's status to determine the most cost-effective and legally sound resolution. This often means carefully evaluating the options of financing the principal, completing the contract itself, or tendering the completion to a third party. The decision must be guided by the terms of the surety bond, applicable contract law, and regulatory requirements designed to ensure fair dealing and financial solvency within the surety market. The regulatory framework for contract surety in the U.S. emphasizes the surety's responsibility to act in good faith and to minimize damages upon default. Financing the principal, while potentially preserving the principal's business and the existing contractual relationship, carries significant risk if the principal's underlying issues are not resolvable. This approach could lead to further financial exposure for the surety if the principal cannot recover. Completing the contract directly, while giving the surety maximum control, can be resource-intensive and may expose the surety to operational complexities and liabilities it is not equipped to handle. It also requires significant upfront capital and management oversight. Tendering the completion to a third party, while often a prudent choice, requires careful selection of a competent contractor and diligent oversight to ensure the work is completed to the obligee's satisfaction and within budget. Failure to properly manage this process can still result in significant losses and reputational damage. Professionals must adopt a structured decision-making process. This begins with a comprehensive review of the default, the principal's financial condition, the obligee's demands, and the terms of the bond. A risk assessment of each potential resolution strategy is crucial, considering financial exposure, legal liabilities, and operational feasibility. Consultation with legal counsel specializing in surety law is essential to navigate the complexities of default resolution and ensure compliance with all regulatory obligations. The ultimate decision should prioritize fulfilling the surety's obligations to the obligee in the most efficient and responsible manner, aligning with the principles of good faith and sound business practice. Question 19. Performance analysis shows a contractor has failed to meet critical milestones on a public works project, leading the obligee to issue a notice of default and demand performance from the surety. The surety receives the demand and immediately contacts the obligee to request all documentation related to the contractor's alleged default and the resulting damages. The surety then initiates a review of the contract, the bond, and the obligee's submitted documentation, while also attempting to contact the defaulting contractor for their perspective and any mitigating circumstances. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and regulatorily compliant approach for the surety to undertake in investigating this default claim? Option A. Advise the obligee that the surety will only proceed with an investigation if the obligee provides a detailed legal opinion from their counsel confirming the contractor's breach of contract. Option B. Immediately tender a settlement offer to the obligee that covers a portion of the claimed damages, based on the assumption that the contractor's default is valid, but seeking to minimize the surety's exposure. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive and objective investigation, gathering all relevant facts and documentation from both the obligee and the contractor to determine the validity of the default and the extent of damages before making a decision on the claim. Option D. Deny the claim outright based on the obligee's assertion of default, advising the obligee that the surety is not obligated to investigate further as the contractor has clearly failed to perform. The correct answer is B. Immediately tender a settlement offer to the obligee that covers a portion of the claimed damages, based on the assumption that the contractor's default is valid but seeking to minimize the surety's exposure. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because the surety faces competing pressures, fulfilling its contractual obligations to the obligee, protecting its financial interests by avoiding unnecessary payouts, and adhering to regulatory requirements for claims investigation. The surety must exercise sound judgment to balance these demands, ensuring a fair and compliant resolution. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective, and documented investigation of the contractor's default claim. This includes meticulously reviewing the contract, assessing the extent of the contractor's non-performance, evaluating the obligee's damages, and exploring all available remedies, such as requiring the contractor to complete the work or arranging for a substitute contractor. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound because it aligns with the surety's duty to act in good faith and to investigate claims diligently, as often mandated by state insurance regulations governing claims handling and unfair claims settlement practices. It ensures that the surety makes a decision based on facts and contractual terms, rather than assumptions or expediency. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the claim based on the obligee's assertion of default, without independent verification. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a reasonable investigation and could be construed as a breach of the duty of good faith and fair dealing, potentially leading to regulatory penalties for unfair claims settlement practices. Another incorrect approach is to offer a settlement that is significantly less than the demonstrable damages without a valid contractual or factual basis. This also violates principles of good faith and fair dealing, and can be seen as an attempt to exploit the obligee's vulnerable position, which is prohibited by regulations. A further incorrect approach is to delay the investigation and decision-making process unreasonably, causing undue hardship to the obligee. Regulatory frameworks typically impose timeframes for claim investigations and resolutions, and prolonged, unjustified delays are considered unfair claims settlement practices. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic, fact-based approach. First, acknowledge the claim and initiate the investigation promptly. Second, gather all relevant documentation, including the contract, performance bonds, correspondence, and evidence of default and damages. Third, conduct a thorough analysis of the gathered information, comparing it against the terms of the contract and bond. Fourth, communicate clearly and professionally with all parties involved. Fifth, make a decision based on the findings of the investigation and the applicable legal and contractual provisions, documenting all steps and rationale. Question 20. Implementation of a payment bond for a federal highway construction project under the Miller Act. A subcontractor submits a claim for unpaid work. The general contractor, the principal on the bond, disputes the claim, asserting the work was deficient. The surety receives notification of the dispute and the subcontractor's intent to pursue a claim against the bond. What is the surety's most appropriate initial course of action to uphold its obligations under the Miller Act and maintain professional integrity? Option A. Advise the subcontractor to pursue legal action directly against the general contractor and await the outcome of that litigation before considering any action on the bond. Option B. Pay the subcontractor the full amount of their claim without further investigation, assuming the claim is valid due to the subcontractor's submission, to expedite resolution and avoid potential legal entanglements. Option C. Deny the subcontractor's claim outright, citing the general contractor's dispute, and inform the subcontractor that the surety's obligation is contingent solely on the principal's admission of liability. Option D. Immediately investigate the subcontractor's claim and the general contractor's dispute, gathering all relevant documentation and communicating with both parties to determine the validity of the claim and the principal's obligation under the bond. The correct answer is D. Immediately investigate the subcontractor's claim and the general contractor's dispute, gathering all relevant documentation and communicating with both parties to determine the validity of the claim and the principal's obligation under the bond. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial needs of a subcontractor with the surety's obligations and the legal framework governing public works projects. The surety's role is to guarantee performance and payment, and any deviation from the Miller Act or Little Miller Acts can expose the surety to significant financial and legal risks, as well as reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance while managing risk. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the subcontractor's claim and the underlying contract, followed by a decision based on the surety's contractual obligations and the applicable statutes. This approach prioritizes adherence to the Miller Act's payment bond provisions, which are designed to protect unpaid subcontractors. The surety must assess whether the subcontractor's claim is valid and if the principal, the general contractor, has failed to make payment as required by the contract and the bond. If the claim is valid and the principal is in default, the surety must fulfill its payment obligations under the bond to avoid further legal action and to uphold its commitment to the obligee. This aligns with the ethical duty to act with integrity and to honor contractual commitments, as well as the legal requirement to comply with the payment bond provisions of the Miller Act or its state-specific Little Miller Act equivalent. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the subcontractor's claim without proper investigation, simply because the principal disputes it. This fails to acknowledge the surety's independent obligation under the payment bond and the subcontractor's statutory right to payment. It also risks violating the spirit and letter of the Miller Act, which provides a direct remedy to unpaid subcontractors. Another incorrect approach would be to pay the subcontractor without verifying the validity of the claim or the principal's default. While seemingly helpful, this could lead to the surety paying for work not performed, work improperly performed, or amounts not legitimately owed, thereby exposing the surety to financial loss and potentially creating disputes with the principal. This approach bypasses the due diligence required by the surety's underwriting and risk management processes and could be seen as a failure to act prudently in managing its financial obligations. Further incorrect approach would be to advise the subcontractor to sue the principal directly and wait for the outcome before the surety intervenes. While the subcontractor does have recourse against the principal, the payment bond is specifically designed to provide a more direct and timely remedy, especially when the principal is unable or unwilling to pay. The surety's involvement is intended to prevent such protracted disputes and ensure prompt payment for labor and materials. Delaying the surety's response undermines the purpose of the payment bond and the protections afforded by the Miller Act. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Acknowledging the claim and initiating a prompt investigation. 2. Reviewing the contract documents, the payment bond, and the subcontractor's claim thoroughly. 3. Communicating with both the principal and the subcontractor to gather all relevant facts and understand their positions. 4. Assessing the validity of the claim against the terms of the contract and the provisions of the applicable Miller Act or Little Miller Act. 5. Making a decision based on the findings, prioritizing compliance with legal obligations and ethical responsibilities to all parties involved.